I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Prince Harry had entered expecting answers. What he heard instead left him unable to remain in the room. Inside a private jeweler's review, a sealed collection linked to Prince Philip was formally opened. Its instructions read aloud, and one name emerged above every other: Prince George. Not William, not Harry, not a shared family trust. George alone. Within moments, the Duke pushed back his chair, said almost nothing, and walked out. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry had arrived believing the meeting would settle family history. William sat opposite him, representing his son's interests, while jewelers cataloged pieces Philip had ordered sealed. The review was private, meaning only those directly involved could hear the instructions. That mattered because these were not ordinary valuables. They carried memory and meaning from a man both brothers had loved. The lead jeweler opened the inventory and read the central instruction. Philip's sealed personal collection had been left to Prince George alone. No division among grandchildren, no secondary allocation for Harry, no shared arrangement with William. The future king's eldest son was named as sole beneficiary, and the words appeared more than once. Harry listened without reacting, but each repetition tightened something in him. He had expected perhaps a watch, a letter, some object with emotional weight. Instead, he heard exclusion written with precision. Harry finally moved. He pushed his chair back, looked directly at William, and asked, "You knew about this?" The prince answered quietly that he had not. Harry held his gaze, searching for something more, but nothing came. Then he placed the inventory on the table, turned away, and walked through the door before the jeweler could finish. William did not follow. He knew anger was only the first layer. The jeweler continued, because Philip had left more than a beneficiary's name. The instructions placed restrictions around the collection, preserving it for George under conditions that prevented casual redistribution. A sealed collection, in plain terms, meant personal items deliberately locked away with written directions controlling when and how they could be released. Then came the detail that changed everything. Beneath the inventory sat a second envelope in Philip's handwriting, marked to be opened only after George's status had been formally confirmed. William stayed seated, as Harry disappeared down the corridor. The collection had already wounded one brother, but the unopened message promised something more dangerous than value: a reason. Harry's exit looked like the explosion, but the real force behind it had been building for years, and understanding the three princes at the center of this moment changes everything. The collection was valuable, but money was not what made the decision so painful. Philip had occupied a unique place in Harry's life, William's life, and the childhood of George. Each relationship carried a different meaning. Each man could look at the same sealed boxes and see something entirely different: memory, duty, rejection, responsibility. And now one inheritance had forced those private meanings into the same room. Harry moved quickly down the corridor, but the anger that had carried him through the door was already beginning to change. Prince Philip had never been a distant figure to him. He had been blunt when others were careful, disciplined when others hesitated, and capable of using humor when family life became unbearably heavy. For the Duke, his grandfather represented something steady during years when almost everything else seemed capable of shifting without warning. That was why the inheritance hurt. It was not about wanting a watch, cufflinks, or some valuable object. It was about wondering what Philip's decision said about the man he had become. William carried a different burden. He was grieving as a grandson, while also acting as George's father, protecting the interests of a child who did not yet understand what had just been placed in his future. A beneficiary, in simple terms, is the person legally or formally chosen to receive property or assets. George had been named as that person alone. William understood that distinction clearly, and it left him trapped between defending his son and respecting the pain now consuming his brother. Harry stopped beside a window and pressed his fingers against his forehead. An aide approached carefully, but he raised one hand and said, "Don't follow me." The Duke needed silence because the language from the inventory would not leave him. George had not been included alongside others. He had not been given one sentimental piece among many. Philip had chosen him deliberately, repeatedly, and without division. That precision cut deeper than Harry wanted anyone to see. William remained with the jewelers and finally asked the question that mattered most. Had George been chosen simply because he was the firstborn of the next generation, or had Philip intended something more personal? The lead jeweler checked the documented instructions before answering. He explained that the wording repeatedly used three ideas: continuity, stewardship, and the boy who will carry memory forward. Stewardship meant protecting something for the future, rather than treating it as personal property. William went still. Those words pulled an old memory forward. George did not yet know what waited inside the collection, but his father suddenly remembered one quiet encounter between the boy and Philip from years earlier. What had seemed insignificant then now felt like the beginning of everything. To everyone else, George's name seemed surprising. To William, one memory from Philip's final years began to explain exactly where this extraordinary decision had started. Every family decision has a moment that later looks like the beginning. In this story, that moment came years before the sealed boxes were opened. It happened during an informal family gathering at Windsor, when George was still young enough to be spoken around rather than spoken to. Philip watched the boy do something small, almost forgettable. But afterward, he asked William to remain behind, and what he said became the hidden trigger for everything that followed. Philip had already begun thinking carefully about what would happen to the objects he valued most: military keepsakes, watches, cufflinks, handwritten notes, private gifts. None of them mattered because of price alone. They carried stories. Some marked service, others friendship, sacrifice, or moments that only the family understood. The Duke of Edinburgh had grown increasingly uneasy about seeing such pieces scattered, forgotten in storage, or divided simply because tradition expected property to move according to rank. George changed that thinking during one quiet Windsor lunch. The young prince noticed an old naval presentation box near his great-grandfather and asked a question that caught Philip completely off guard. He did not ask whether it was expensive. He asked why it mattered. Philip explained that the box came from a chapter of his naval life and carried memories no valuation could capture. George listened, closed the lid carefully, and said it should stay in the family so someone remembers the story. Philip said little at first. Later, after the others had gone, he asked William to remain behind. The future king expected casual conversation, but his grandfather's mood had shifted. Philip told him that preserving memory required more than owning things. Someone had to understand why those things mattered. William felt the weight of the words, yet he treated them as grandfatherly reflection rather than a decision being formed in real time. Harry knew nothing about that exchange. Years later, that absence would become painfully important. He would hear George's name in the sealed instructions and interpret it as exclusion, never realizing that one innocent question from a child had quietly reshaped Philip's thinking. The Duke had not been comparing grandchildren. He had been searching for a future custodian of memory. Philip acted soon afterward. He summoned his jeweler and private secretary, meaning the senior aide responsible for recording and managing sensitive personal instructions. He ordered selected pieces, separated from the wider estate, and demanded that the beneficiary's identity remain sealed. The final written direction later connected George's inheritance directly to that Windsor conversation. Harry would eventually learn every detail, but understanding the reason did not calm him. It sharpened one painful question. Why had William never told him? The mystery of George's selection had been answered, but the explanation pushed Harry toward the confrontation he had been avoiding since the moment he left the jeweler's room. Harry did not leave the palace grounds. He waited, and when William finally emerged from the review, there were no jewelers, secretaries, or formal statements between them. Only two brothers standing across from each other, with Philip's decision hanging in the silence. Harry asked one question first. It was simple, direct, and loaded with years of suspicion. Did you know he was giving everything to George? William answered without hesitation. He knew Philip had separated certain personal objects from the wider estate, but he had never been told that Prince George was the sole beneficiary. A sole beneficiary simply meant one person had been chosen to receive the entire specified collection, rather than sharing it with others. The prince insisted the sealed wording had surprised him too. Harry did not look convinced. To him, the distinction sounded painfully familiar. Harry stepped closer and challenged what William was really saying. His brother had always stood nearer to the machinery surrounding royal decisions. nearer to private secretaries, family briefings, and the people trusted with sensitive arrangements. "You always find out last," Harry said bitterly. "But somehow you land on the right side of it." The accusation landed hard. William stiffened, then warned him not to turn George into a target for a decision the boy had never made. Harry reacted instantly. He told William this was not jealousy of George. It was about Philip. It was about hearing his grandfather make a deliberate choice and wondering whether that choice carried a judgment about his own place in the family. The Duke had already lost the comfort of believing the collection was divided by chance. Now he knew the decision had purpose behind it, and that purpose felt personal. William lowered his voice. The jewelers had found something else beneath the original inventory. A second sealed note addressed not to George but to "my grandsons." He explained that the note was protected by a specific release condition, meaning a written instruction controlling when sensitive material could be opened. Philip had ordered that neither brother hear the message alone. Both had to agree to receive it together. Harry shook his head and turned away. He wanted no more hidden conditions, no more carefully timed revelations, no more messages arriving years too late. William did not stop him. He only repeated one line from the documented instruction the jewelers had read aloud. Philip wanted the note heard before resentment becomes inheritance. Harry stopped. The anger remained, but those words had changed its direction. Their grandfather had expected conflict. Worse, he had prepared for it. Philip had left George the collection, but he had left William and Harry something else entirely, a final intervention, designed to prevent the objects from becoming weapons between them. The most powerful part of Philip's plan was not hidden inside the jewelry boxes. It was hidden inside the rules. He had anticipated arguments over value, entitlement, hierarchy, and family grievance. And he had constructed the inheritance so that none of them could alter his intention. Even the king could not casually redirect it. Even William could not distribute it. George had been chosen, but Philip had also chosen exactly how everyone else would be forced to confront that fact. Charles read the relevant clause in private and immediately understood how deliberate the structure was. The collection sat under a custodial arrangement, meaning the items legally remained protected for George, while another trusted person managed them until he reached certain stages of adulthood. William had been named temporary custodian because he was the boy's father, but that did not make him owner. The prince could not absorb the pieces into his own holdings, sell them, gift them, or redistribute them simply to ease tension. The king removed his glasses and set them beside the file. For several seconds, he said nothing. His father had separated emotion from authority with almost surgical precision. Charles could feel the personal weight behind that choice because Philip had clearly expected pressure after his death. The monarch finally told William that altering the arrangement just to calm wounded feelings would destroy the very principle his father had built into it. William agreed, though he knew exactly who would hear that decision as another closed door. The jewelers then documented the items carrying Philip's personal annotations. One naval watch had a short note beside it. A pair of presentation cufflinks carried another. A private signet piece was marked for later explanation, while one small case had been sealed with a clear instruction that George was not to open it until the age of 21. Those annotations mattered, because they proved the collection was not simply a transfer of wealth. Philip had arranged a personal archive, a carefully chosen group of objects meant to preserve the story attached to his life. Harry learned the terms through the documented account from the jewelers, and immediately understood the consequence. Charles would not intervene. William could not change the allocation. No palace official could quietly divide the collection afterward. Every possible route around Philip's decision had been closed before the first box was ever opened. Harry could still argue with the meaning, but he could no longer argue with the mechanism. That distinction hurt more than he expected. With every escape route closed, Harry's anger could no longer be directed at palace procedure. He now had to decide what Philip's decision meant about him personally. The loudest moment had been Harry walking out. The harder moment came afterward, when nobody was watching. No confrontation, no cameras, no brother standing opposite him. Only the knowledge that a grandfather he loved had spent time deciding where deeply personal objects should go, and had written another name. Anger had protected Harry from that realization inside the room. Once the door closed behind him, the anger began collapsing into something far more difficult to carry. Harry retreated to a private sitting room and asked for several minutes alone before anyone contacted him again. The Duke still had the summary page he had taken from the table, but now he was no longer staring at the list of watches, cufflinks, and keepsakes. He was reading Philip's language. Continuity, stewardship, memory. Those words mattered because they suggested judgment, not random distribution. To Harry, that distinction transformed a painful inheritance into something far more personal. Harry folded the page once in frustration, then immediately stopped. He unfolded it carefully and smoothed the crease with both hands, irritated with himself for handling anything connected to Philip so roughly. That small reaction broke through the anger. The objects were not what he wanted. What he wanted was reassurance that his grandfather had still seen him as someone capable of carrying family memory forward. Harry finally allowed one aide back into the room. In a private conversation, he admitted what had been underneath the fury from the beginning. George receiving the collection was not the real wound. The fear was that Philip had stopped trusting him with the meaning behind it. The Duke said quietly that being left out of the boxes felt like being left out of the story. Even as he said it, he knew the thought sounded harsher than the facts, but pain rarely waits for perfect logic. William chose silence instead of pressure. The prince sent no argument, no defense of George, and no demand that his brother return. He sent only one message. The second note would remain sealed until Harry chose to hear it. A sealed note, in simple terms, was a private written message protected from release until specific conditions were met. Philip had made both brothers consent one of those conditions. Harry read the message twice. William's restraint unsettled him because it removed the easiest excuse to keep fighting. Nobody was forcing him now. The next move belonged entirely to him. Nearly an hour passed before Harry finally replied with 4 words. No staff. Just us. William understood immediately. The inheritance had divided the brothers in public silence. Philip's final note was about to place them together in private, with nowhere left to hide behind rank or procedure. There were no jewelers in the room when the second envelope was opened. No aides. No king. No one to translate the words or soften their impact. William and Harry sat alone across a small table, while Philip's handwriting rested between them. For the first time since the collection had been revealed, the argument was no longer about George. It was about what their grandfather feared might happen between the two men sitting there. William placed the envelope between them and did not touch it again. He told Harry that nothing would be opened unless they both agreed. The sealed envelope was a private message, protected by Philip's written instruction, meaning neither brother could hear it without the other present. Harry stared at it, then finally nodded. The prince broke the seal carefully and unfolded a short note addressed simply to his grandsons. William began reading. Philip's words were direct. Possessions, he warned, could become symbols of love, rejection, loyalty, and resentment if families allowed them to carry more meaning than they should. Harry looked down as the message made one point unmistakable. Unequal inheritance did not mean unequal affection. The Duke had spent hours fearing exactly that. Now his grandfather was answering the wound before Harry had ever spoken it aloud. Harry stiffened when William reached another line about different burdens for different lives. He turned away for a moment, clearly affected. The prince stopped reading and admitted quietly that he understood why George being chosen had felt personal. Harry did not argue this time. He simply listened. William continued, and the reason became clearer. Philip had chosen Prince George because the boy was young enough to receive the objects without old rivalries, disappointments, or expectations already attached to them. The collection was not meant to reward one branch of the family. It was meant to begin again with someone who could inherit the stories without inheriting the grievances. Harry finally heard the line that changed everything. Philip wrote that his older grandsons already possessed something George never could: direct memories of him. They remembered his voice, his humor, his discipline, his temper, his advice. The boy would inherit objects because William and Harry had inherited experiences. Harry sat quietly before saying, "Then make sure he knows the stories." William answered immediately. George would hear them from both brothers, not from labels inside a box. The agreement did not erase the walkout or the hurt behind it. But by the time they left that room, Philip's collection still belonged to George alone, and its meaning no longer belonged to one side of a family dispute. Once the story escaped the palace, The first headlines focused on rupture, Harry walking out, George inheriting everything, another royal divide. But public opinion shifted when one detail emerged from the sealed instructions. This was not a treasure grab. It was a grandfather's attempt to send memory forward. And one photograph outside Windsor captured that shift more powerfully than any official statement could. Harry's exit became the first version of the story, because conflict travels faster than explanation. Broadcasters focused on the Duke leaving the jeweler's review, while newspapers emphasized that Prince George alone had been named beneficiary. A beneficiary, in simple terms, is the person chosen to receive property or assets. The early framing made the decision sound severe. One young prince receiving everything, while older relatives received nothing from the sealed collection. The palace then issued a documented communication confirming the structure. George was the sole beneficiary, William was only temporary custodian, and Philip's written instructions could not simply be rearranged after his death. The prince therefore held responsibility without ownership. That detail mattered because it weakened the idea that William had personally benefited from the decision. It also shifted attention back toward Philip and the reason he had designed the inheritance so carefully. Harry became the emotional center of the coverage again when he left a later private meeting, far calmer than before. Commentators immediately noticed the difference. Some argued that selecting one great-grandchild had created unnecessary pain. Others believed Philip had every right to decide where his personal belongings should go. But the question changed when broadcasters cited the documented account of George's Windsor conversation with his great-grandfather. The boy had asked why an old naval object mattered, not what it was worth. Crowds gathered outside Windsor Castle as the story dominated the day. One newspaper carried a photograph of Philip beside a young George under the stark headline, "Keep the Story." The phrase spread quickly because it captured something the earlier coverage had missed. This was no longer simply about jewelry, watches, or inheritance. It was about memory being deliberately handed forward. The coverage turned almost overnight. George receives Philip's valuables, became Philip chooses George as keeper of his personal history. Harry's walkout still mattered, but now it looked less like rejection of George and more like the reaction of a grandson struggling to understand what had first felt like rejection of himself. Only one moment remained. Harry still had to face George directly. The public had found its interpretation, but the story would only truly end when Harry faced the person who had inherited everything without ever asking for any of it. In the end, the most important exchange did not happen over diamonds, watches, cufflinks, or sealed boxes. It happened when Harry finally stood with George and understood the distinction Philip had been trying to make. The boy had not inherited a victory over anyone. He had inherited a responsibility, and Harry had not been stripped of his grandfather's memory. He had been asked, in a far more difficult way, to become one of the people capable of passing that memory on. William arranged for Prince George to hear the truth privately and in terms he could understand. The prince explained that the collection was not simply a group of valuable possessions waiting to become his. Several pieces would remain sealed until he was older, and the arrangement required him to preserve them rather than treat them casually. Stewardship, in plain language, meant caring for something important so it could survive beyond one person. George listened quietly, understanding that Philip had left him responsibility along with inheritance. Harry entered after the conversation had begun. George hesitated before asking the question nobody expected him to ask. Was his uncle angry because Philip had chosen him? The Duke stopped. For a moment, every argument from the previous days seemed to return. Then Harry moved closer and answered simply, "No, I was upset because I didn't understand why." George looked relieved, but his uncle was not finished. Harry explained that Philip cared about the stories attached to objects more than the objects themselves. A watch could carry a memory. A pair of cufflinks could represent a friendship. A naval keepsake could hold decades of service inside one small object. The Duke promised George that when the sealed boxes were eventually opened, he would tell him what he remembered. George would not inherit labels. He would inherit living stories. William then handed Harry a copy of Philip's second note. The prince said nothing as his brother read the familiar words again. Harry folded the paper carefully, placed it inside his jacket, and kept it there. This time, he did not abandon anything on a table. The collection remained exactly where Philip intended it to remain, with George alone, protected from redistribution and preserved for his future. William accepted the duty of guarding it. Harry accepted something harder, that being excluded from the boxes had never meant being excluded from his grandfather's affection. Harry's walkout was no longer the ending. It had become the turning point. Philip's decision exposed old wounds, forced two brothers to confront what inheritance could make them believe, and finally separated possession from love. George inherited the collection. William inherited responsibility. Harry reclaimed understanding. And Philip's final intention survived untouched. Memory would move forward, not as wealth to be divided, but as history to be protected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.